First 6 pages of how it works is the third step, and the second 7 pages of how it works is the fourth step, page 64 through 71. Tonight we're going to try to get through the entire resentment list, and what it is we're going to be looking at here is, remember, we're trying to find, and this is the words of the book here. We're trying to make a strenuous effort to face the things that have been blocking us from God and to be rid of the things in our lives, in ourselves, which had been blocking us from God. Our liquor was but a symptom. And what we're calling these is, we're going to find primarily that there are essentially 3 of them. There is anger, fear, and guilt. Guilt brought on by the dishonesty, which is all based in selfishness. Okay, now the guilt is obviously going to be amends when we look at amends later on, and the fear is going to be dealt with through faith in God, and this anger is going to be dealt with through forgiveness. And what we're going to see here is we're going to see how to make this list, and we're going to see that it's important to do exactly as he says here, to put it on paper and to tell another person about it. It's important because this is it's got this three-pronged spiritual solution that we have of admitting it to ourselves, to God, and to another human being. The same thing with our fears. We admit our fears to ourselves, to God, and to another human being. And so here we're going to read about the bottom paragraph on page 64 is where we left off last week. Okay, resentment or anger. I've heard so many people say that resentment is different than anger. I'll tell you, I will show you in just a minute that he uses 3 different words. Anger he uses twice, resentment he uses once, and grudge list he uses once. So he's called it now a grudge list: anger, angry, and resentment. So take that however you want to. All those guys that are standing around going, resentment's different, and what you're getting off on some sort of technical tangent that is irrelevant. I'll tell you, I got off on one of those little irrelevant tangents too, and I said, you mean to tell me, and this is myself early on in sobriety with the guy who was teaching me, I said, do you mean to tell me that there is no case in my life that I have justified anger? That if somebody raped and murdered my sister, I did not have a justifiable anger to want to put that guy in a hole somewhere? And the guy says to me, he goes, it's not about justifying your anger. It's about finding what blocks you from God. What we're saying here is you do not want to get angry. You don't want to stew in it. You don't want it to roll round and round in your head for hours, weeks, days, months, or even years in your head, because that's what's blocking you off from essentially step 12. Service to God is the way we're looking at it as recovering alcoholics. Our primary form of service to God is going to be step 12. What's keeping you from this service to God to step 12 is this anger we're saying here. So he's saying that resentment is the number one offender. Not for some of us, not for this guy and that one, and these two have got some other thing going on with them. Every one of us as alcoholics, our number one problem is our anger. Resentment is the number one offender, and it destroys more alcoholics than anything else. Now, why does he say that it destroys more alcoholics than anything else? Because essentially, untreated alcoholism, and you're going to spot it in some people, when you get a handle on this idea that anger is the number one problem that I have as an alcoholic, you're going to begin to see it in other people, and you're going to, oh, that guy's angry as hell, I can see that, and this one. And what I've come to know in it as untreated alcoholism. Untreated alcoholism is an angry person. When you see somebody who says they have 10 years of sobriety and they're screaming at everybody and always getting into arguments with people, that's untreated alcoholism, because obviously if resentment is the number one offender and they're going around angry all the time, it's safe to say that they're not applying the spiritual program of the inventory or the solutions to be free of it, as he says, to be rid of it, to face and to be rid of the things in ourselves which had been blocking us from doing God's will all along. So, from it stem all forms of spiritual disease. Now, that idea right there, as we work our way through these lists of the inventory, there are basically 3 lists. One of them is split into 2. The list of harms done others is split into harms done others sexually and harms done others other than sexual. And then we have the anger list and the fears list. So these next 1, 2, 3, the next 3 pages are the resentment list, essentially. Well, 1, 2, about 2.5 pages, are the resentment list, followed by the spiritual solution, which is one of the things that Bill Wilson does in here, is he tells us what the resentment list is. If you'll look and read into it, you'll see what you're doing, why you're doing it, and the solution to it. Why am I making it? Because remember, we're looking to be rid of this anger. We're not. He says repeatedly, we turn back to this list, for it held the key to our future. We keep turning back to this list. We don't mail it off to ourselves and put it in a bottle and throw it out in the ocean or burn it or whatever. Some of the goofy things I've heard from some of the meetings I've been in over the years. From it stem all forms of spiritual disease. What he's saying there is, when we straighten out this anger and the fear and the guilt that we have for having harmed others, that from these things stem all the other forms of spiritual disease. And by bringing these under control, all the other sub-forms that may stem from these, anger, fear, and guilt, there could be hundreds of sub-forms of self that are rooted in these primary forms. And by bringing these primary forms of self under control, it will inadvertently, or as a byproduct, bring all those other forms of self under control, because they are stemming from these. Do you understand that? That's a real simple concept. So all you have to do in your inventory is make an inventory of about 3 things: what you are angry about, what you are afraid of, and what you've done that's harmed other people. And by cleaning this mess up, all the other stuff that's just comes from that will fall into place, just by naturally what he says. When we straighten out, hang on, let me go ahead and read. From it stem all forms of spiritual disease, for we have been not only mentally and physically ill, we have been spiritually sick. So when we straighten these things out, when the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. Essentially what he's saying there is, when we get a hold of this anger, this fear, and this guilt, and apply the spiritual solutions to it, all these other problems will straighten themselves out, because the cause of what's making us mentally and physically ill will be, like, the underlying cause and condition will be being dealt with. Okay. In dealing with resentments, we set them on paper. He doesn't say we did it in our head. He's given us an example on this next page over here. We're going to be referring to this now. In dealing with resentments, we set them on paper, and he's fixing to tell us that first column over there. There's not list, this is a column. There's 3 columns in this first list of resentments. I get a lot of people I work with say they get confused with the columns and lists. This one list has 3 separate columns in it. A column of, this is what he says: we listed people, institutions, or principles with whom we were angry. That's that first column on the next page over there. I am resentful at Mr. Brown, Mrs. Jones, my employer, and my wife. Okay? And I got, my list has, in their order, the way my sponsor told me to do it, myself at the top, and my mother and father, my sister, my brother, my grandparents, my children and cousins and uncles and aunts and ex-wives and girlfriends and best friends, past employers, the cops, the politics, religion, race, government, the ex-wives, and all of these. My sponsor said, don't sit down and figure out who you're angry at. He said, just go ahead and write down everybody's name and then figure out what it was you were angry at them about. Because if you're anything like me, it wasn't just 1 or 2 things. It's pretty much everything. In most cases, it was found, we asked ourselves why we were angry. That's that second column, the cause of the anger. Mr. Brown's paying attention to his wife, and Mr. Jones, or Mrs. Jones, she committed her husband for drinking. He's my friend. She's a nut. His employer threatens to fire him. He's unjust, overbearing. And his wife nags and wants the house put in her name, misunderstands, likes Brown. So this is what we're doing here. We're looking to see what it is who it is we're angry at, what it is that they did, and the part of our life that it's affected, that has made us angry. That is essentially what this anger is a reaction that I'm having to something that they did. And what we're looking at here is we're going to be seeing that no one really makes a conscious decision to get angry. It's a sort of a defense mechanism, if you would. Like if you burn your hand on a hot stove, you don't make a decision to pull your hand away from it. You can try to hold your hand on that thing all day long. It's going to pull back. It's almost like your hand has a mind of its own. If you can feel that hot stove in your hand, you are going to pull back, trust me. And so, too, when somebody does something, you're going to get angry because we don't know how to deal with this anger. Of course, this anger is different than the hot stove thing because we have a path to free ourselves from the reaction that we're having. And you know how he puts it in the 9-step promises that we will intuitively know how to handle situations which used to baffle us? This is what he's talking about here. Through the process, when he says in step 12, we practice these principles in all our affairs, this is what he's saying. He's saying we're going to find our anger, we're going to get a good look at it, and we're going to apply forgiveness to it. And over the period of weeks, months, years of practicing the principle of forgiveness on our anger, we're going to intuitively know how to handle that anger. Over the period of years or weeks, months, whatever it is, however your learning curve is, for me, it's taken, I would have to admit, many years to get a handle on, to even understand what it was before I came across somebody who knew what the hell they were talking about to help me understand it. So in this third column, he says, in most cases it is found that our self-esteem, our pocketbooks, our ambitions, our personal relationships, including sex, were hurt or threatened, so we were sore, we were burned up. So here's where he says on our grudge list. And, you know, just so you back up a little bit, over there he says we listed people, institutions, and principles with whom we were angry. There's that word angry. And you hear people say, oh, resentment's different than anger. I tell you, I've heard that from a number of people over the years, and I just want to throw something in, like a crumble-up coffee cup and knock them in the head with it or something. I've actually seen people break the word resentment down into syllables and try to figure out what re means and what resent, S-E-N-T, what does sent mean? What does meant mean? Re-sent, meant, and break the syllables down and try to explain the syllables. And I'm going, what the flip are they talking about? What the stink are they doing? I can't figure it. And I got to tell you, one of the things I've learned over the years is when you come across somebody who tells you something like that and it makes you confused and you say, what the hell is he talking about? I don't get it. I must be foggy from the alcohol is still lifting, and I'm incapable of comprehending the complexities of this. The chances are someone's explaining this to you in a complicated manner because that's how it is to them. It's confusing the hell out of them, and they're complicated, and they got to break it down into syllables and try to understand what each part of this word means, when all we're doing is we're saying when you get in somebody's face and start screaming at them, or when you're thinking for a week of how you're going to get even and key their car or flatten their tires or bust the windows out or knock them in the head, and you're spending 2 weeks doing this, you got to stop doing that. That is the root cause of alcoholism. That it is the most common form of selfish, self-centered behavior that we have as alcoholics. Okay, this third column, in most cases, it is found that our self-esteem, our pocketbooks, our ambitions, personal relationships, including sex, were hurt or threatened, so we were sore, we were burned up. So here's where he says, on our grudge list. So he's called it 3 separate things, a resentment list, a grudge list, and angry. Damn, Jim. You all right, buddy? I can hardly hear myself talk over you. Okay, so we asked ourselves, why were we angry? Twice he calls it an angry list. Once he says resentments, and once he says grudge. The point being that don't get hung up on that word resentment any more than I got hung up. I got hung up on the moral inventory thing. I scratched my head for years going, what in the hell? I did the list with another guy who explained it to me. He didn't explain it to me. He said, go write down who your whole family and everybody you know and say what you were angry about and what it affected. And I did the whole thing, and I still scratched my head and said, what in the hell is a moral inventory? What moral? I just don't get it. It's not. It's all the moral inventory means. It's a college-educated way of saying that we're looking for the most common manifestations of self that block us from receiving and doing God's will. That's all we're doing. And those are the words that are coming from the book here. It is a list to face and to be rid of the things in ourselves which had been blocking us, and what's been blocking us is being convinced that self manifested in various ways was what had defeated us. We considered its most common manifestations. It's a list of the most common manifestations of selfish, self-centered behavior that block me from receiving and doing God's will, which is a life of self-sacrifice and work for others. Step 12, essentially. It's a reference to Step 12. We're looking for what's blocking us from doing Step 12. All these first 11 steps are all about putting your house in order, and the right answers will come. That's all he's talking about. And we're trying to get these things out of the way here. So on our grudge list, we set opposite each name our injuries. Was it our self-esteem, our security, our ambitions, or personal relations, personal or sex relations, which had been interfered with? We were usually as definite as this example, and he gives you these 3 columns. And it's easy to see the first column is I'm angry with these people in my life. The cause of the anger is what they did that made me angry. And later on, we're going to see that did we not ourselves set the ball rolling as part of the solution to forgiveness, is we're going to see that a lot of times these people are retaliating for something that we did against them. When we write this next list, it's going to be the list of harms done others. One of the things about that is we're going to be seeing that we had harmed these people, and in many cases, not every one, but in many cases, all they were doing was retaliating against us because they, like ourselves, are people who try to get even when somebody messes with them and threatens their instincts. And that third column there, for myself, it's important to see this third column because it's important for me to see that I never made a conscious decision to be that selfish, self-centered person. I'm simply reacting to somebody threatening my sex relations, my self-esteem, and you see how that last sub-column almost is fear. What do they call that? Got those little brackets along the side of fear on each one of them. So essentially what he's saying is that fear is at the root of all anger. Everything that you have, I am angry with Mr. Brown because he's paying attention to my wife. It affects my sex relations, my self-esteem. It's rooted in fear that I'm afraid Mr. Brown is going to be hitting on my wife and she just might give in because I'm a drunken bum and she's going to leave me. You understand that? The same way with down here with the employer. The employer, I'm angry with the employer, and it affects my self-esteem, my security. I'm angry because he's going to fire me for padding my expense account, and it's rooted in fear. I am afraid he's going to fire me. And every single time that you are angry, you will see through this column and these columns in this list, that the reason for the anger is fear. That out of fear, I get angry with people because they're threatening me. And the important thing in that area for me is to notice that I really didn't make a conscious decision to be a real angry person. It doesn't do so much to clear my guilty conscience, but it helps me understand what's happening to me. I thought I would, when someone said you're a selfish, self-centered person, I kind of backed into a corner and said, well, I guess I am a selfish, self-centered person, and I must have sometime or another made a decision to do that. I'm an intellectually smart guy, and somewhere I don't remember when it was, but the truth of the matter was I just had never really learned how to not be a selfish, self-centered person. I was essentially a victim of my own instincts, my natural instincts for self-preservation. So you ask yourself, how far back do you go with this list? I always tell my sponsees, I say, look, if you got 5 names on the list, maybe that's not enough. You need to add some names to it. My second sponsor said, all I want you to do is write down what you are angry about right now. Don't go back and write things you were angry about 30 years ago. My first sponsor said write everybody's name down. And it's really, the directions that Bill gives is he says we went back through our lives here at the bottom of the page here. We went back through our lives and nothing counted but thoroughness and honesty. So that's pretty much the directions for how far back to go. So it's really left up to us whether or not, and I always say this, I say if you got 200 names on the list, don't make it a list that you're not going to get through. 6 months from now, I'm going to bump into you, and you're going to say, I'm still working on my 4th step. And I say, hey, how's that 4th step coming, buddy? That was 6 months ago, and I'm still working on it. Well, maybe 200 names is too much. Maybe you need to find this happy median of 5 names isn't enough to get the idea of what we're doing here, and 200 names may mean you may not ever get to the 5th step. You understand? There is this median, this happy median of in between those two. So that's the only answer that I've been able to come up with when people ask me how far back do I go, how many names do I write down. And I did the same thing my first sponsor did. I said, stick with these most important, closest people that you've ever had to you. I mean, if you worked for some guy for 6 months, like 10 years ago, and stole a drill from him, really? I mean, okay. If it really gets down to that, you can do that. But we're talking about your mom and dad here, and your sister and your brother, and your cousins and your uncles, and your best friends and your girlfriends and your ex-wives and your children. The people that are closest to you is what we're talking about here. When we were finished, we considered it carefully. The first thing's apparent. was that the world and its people were often quite wrong. To conclude that others were wrong was as far as most of us ever got. The usual outcome was that people continued to wrong us, and we stayed sore. And this is pretty much the future. If you don't do this, if you don't do this inventory and learn the spiritual solution and practice this principle in all your affairs, the usual outcome was that people continued to wrong us and we stayed sore. That, in my opinion, if you stay sober through that, we have a word for that, like I was saying, untreated alcoholism. And untreated alcoholism is in here all the time. Don't believe me? Come into some of these meetings and start paying attention to what people say and how much time they say they have. And when they come in here and go, F this one and F that one and you this and you that and my 20 years, blah, and you go, whew. I don't ever want to get to that place. I want to be someone who's peaceful and serene, you know. But the usual outcome was that people continued to wrong us and we stayed sore. Sometimes it was remorse, and then we were sore at ourselves. But the more we fought and tried to have our own way, the worse matters got. As in war, the victor only seemed to win. Our moments of triumph were short-lived. Now, these two paragraphs here, I have them written as, from the way I learned it, as here's the standing question that I may have. I may have this question of, what's the big deal about anger? I don't get it. I understand that you're saying that anger blocks me from God. Isn't there a case when I can have some kind of justified anger? It's just one of the many human emotions. And what, you know, when he says that for alcoholics, this is a poison. This is a deadly area for us for us alcoholics. And this is what he says about it. These two paragraphs I have highlighted as, why be free of anger? What's the big deal? He says, it is plain that a life which includes deep resentment leads only to futility and unhappiness. And to the precise extent that we permit these, do we squander the hours that might have been worthwhile. But with the alcoholic, whose hope is the maintenance and growth of a spiritual experience, this business of resentment is infinitely grave. We found that it is fatal. For when harboring such feelings, we shut ourselves off from the sunlight of the Spirit. The insanity of alcohol returns, and we drink again. And with us, to drink is to die. If we were to live, we had to be free of anger. The grouch and the brainstorm were not for us. They may be the dubious luxury of normal men, but for alcoholics, these things are poison. So, there's two main points in here. To the precise extent that we permit these angers in our life, do we squander the hours that might have been worthwhile. And for when harboring such feelings, we shut ourselves off from the sunlight of the Spirit, the insanity of alcohol returns, and we drink again. So, this is why we must find this anger. It is the number one most common manifestation of selfish, self-centered behavior in our lives, and it is the number one chief block from between us and God. And from this anger stem all forms of spiritual disease. And I did not make a conscious decision to get angry. I am reacting to something that's happening to me. But what I am going to do is I'm going to reteach my subconscious self how to deal with anger through the process of the inventory, the admission of step 5, the application of forgiveness in step 6 and 7, and the rest of the inventory in which we find what we did to them and to make amends for what we did to them, and to find our fears, the fears at the root of everything, and to have faith in God. The application of these spiritual solutions is our program of action here. So, here's where he tells us we turn back to that list, for it held the key to our future. You don't burn it, send it off to yourself in an envelope, put it in a bottle and throw it out in the ocean, whatever some of these crackpots tell you. You're going to need that list, because this list is what you're going to be working off of with your spiritual solutions and your program of recovery. When we turn back to this list, for it held the key to the future, we were prepared to look at it from an entirely different angle. We began to see that the world and its people really dominated us. In that state, the wrongdoing of others, fancied or real, had power to actually kill. How could we escape? We saw that these resentments must be mastered, but how? Now, this part right here, he says, we could not wish them away any more than alcohol. You see that? So if I tell you that your problem is anger and you go, got it, I'm going to go out there and I'm not going to be angry anymore. I'm going to make my best attempt to not be angry anymore. It won't matter. That's the equivalent to somebody telling you, don't drink alcohol and you'll be just fine. And you go, man, is that the AA thing? I got it. If I just don't drink alcohol, I'm going to be fine. But here's the problem. You go out there and a week later you come back in and go, that didn't work. I tried to not drink alcohol and I drank any damn way. And he says, we saw that these reasons, we could not wish them away any more than alcohol. Turn back to this other page 62 over here. This is one of the references that he's making in this paragraph. He says, in the middle of page 62, he's going to tell us that we have to have God's help to get rid of selfishness, just like we have to have God's help to get rid of our alcohol, okay? So our troubles, we think, are basically of our own making. They arise out of ourselves, and the alcoholic is an extreme example of self-will run riot. Though he usually doesn't think so, above everything, we alcoholics must be rid of this selfishness. We must, or it kills us. And God makes that possible. And there often seems no way of entirely getting rid of self without his aid. And that's a reference to what we're talking about here. You're saying, okay, so I got anger as this number one problem. How do I get rid of this anger? You're going to have God's help, and we're going to show you a precise set of directions on how to apply God's help to your anger, okay? He said, many of us had moral and philosophical convictions galore, but we could not live up to them. What he's stating there is you can say, okay, so you say fear is my problem, and anger is my problem, and guilt is my problem. I'm going to have moral and philosophical convictions galore, and I'm going to go out there and apply all my willpower to it, and I am going to get rid of these things, and it ain't going to work. You're going to come crawling back in here, just like somebody telling you to stop drink alcohol, and you're going to come back in and go, it didn't work. I don't know. I tried to stop being angry. I tried to stop being afraid. I tried to stop feeling guilty about the things I was doing, and it didn't work. Just like telling somebody, don't drink, okay? You got to have something underlying helping that along. We could not live up to them even though we would have liked to. Neither could we reduce our self-centeredness much by wish or trying on our own power. We had to have God's help. This is a reference to we have spiritual solutions in which we're going to bring God into the mix. Remember, in step 5, it's easily seen where he says we admitted to ourselves, to God, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. Anger being the exact nature of our wrong at this point. So all three of those aspects come into play when we talk about the spiritual solutions. Remember when he said we have been spiritually sick, and when the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. So we're getting this idea of a spiritual solution to this anger. Now look what he says here back on page 66 where we left off here. He says, we could not wish them away any more than alcohol. This was our course. This is the directions for how to forgive, these next two paragraphs. One of the most important things in Alcoholics Anonymous. And as we work our way through these remaining inventory pages and all through the rest of the steps, we're going to be referring back to this constantly. Because forgiveness, when you eat all the way out to step 12, when you see we practice these principles in all our affairs, this is what he's talking about. He's not talking about practicing brotherly love or honesty. He's talking about practicing this forgiveness to get rid of this anger. If anger is our number one problem, then forgiveness is the number one thing we're going to be applying to it. This was our course. We realized that the people who wronged us were perhaps spiritually sick. Though we did not like their symptoms and the way these disturbed us, they, like ourselves, were sick too, period. You see there? So the first part of this, I'm going to see the people. I've got it on paper. I'm angry with Mr. Brown. He's paying attention to my wife. It affects my sex relations. I say to myself, they, like ourselves, are sick too. So this Mr. Brown guy must be sick as I am, because what kind of spiritually fit man would be paying attention to another man's wife? You understand that? That the behavior that this other person has exhibited that made me angry with the cause of this resentment is obviously not something that a spiritually fit person would have done, okay? So I'm going to see them in the same light as I see myself, and I know that I am spiritually sick, and I'm trying to find my way. I am literally a lost soul trying to find my way to God, in a sense. And so now I see these other people in that same light. They, like ourselves, were sick too. Now here's the next part we're going to look at, and this is the part where we bring God into it. I'll be done in just a minute here, so we'll open up the floors, like 3 more lines here, as soon as we get through down here to this second list, okay? Now this second part of forgiveness here is where we bring God into the mix. Look where he says, we asked God to help us show them the same tolerance, pity, and patience we would cheerfully grant a sick friend. When a person offended, we said to ourselves, many people call this the fourth step prayer, by the way. Over the years, I have heard people refer to this as the fourth step prayer. But let me tell you what I've learned. I have learned that there is a step in the 12 that instructs us to ask God to remove these character defects, these shortcomings, whatever you want to call them. That he calls them all of them. When he says character defects and shortcomings and exact nature of our wrongs, he's talking about the same exact thing. The most common manifestations of self that block me from a life of service for others, which block us from God's will, which is a life of service for others. But anyway, this is the reference to 6 and 7. Because if in the fourth step I'm asking God to remove these shortcomings, no, this is let me show you a couple other places as we work our way through this that he makes references to all the other steps in here. Let me take you down to almost the bottom of this page where he says, come down, do you see that bottom paragraph where he says, notice that the word fear is bracketed? Go up about 4 lines and you're going to see where he says, when we saw our faults, we listed them. That's a reference to this list too here. But look what he says here. We placed them before us in black and white. That's step 4. We admitted our wrongs honestly. That's a reference to step 5. And we're willing to set these matters straight. That's a reference to steps 8 and 9. So as we're working our way through this fourth step, he's referencing how this fourth step interacts with the other steps. You can easily see now up here, back up in the top, where we're looking at this fourth step prayer, as many people call this. I've heard a number of people knowledgeable old-timers call this the fourth step prayer. But I see it today as a reference to step 6 and 7, because it is in step 6 and 7 that we turn to God and say, please remove this from me, right? So this is what we're saying. He says, we ask God to help us. And once again, we're not asking God to do it for us. Back in that page 62, it said we had to have God's help. We could not be free on our own. There's another phrase that he uses, God makes that possible. There often seems no way of entirely getting rid of self without his aid, not without him doing it for us. It's like asking God for a new car. You're not going to wake up and go out in the front, and there's going to be a new car in the driveway. You're going to have some help with it, okay? You got to get up and go to work and save some money and then get a little credit built up or something like that. The same way with forgiveness. We ask God to help us show them the same tolerance, pity. You know, you guys know those movies that are on. There's a couple of them now with the Almighty series, with Greg Almighty or whatever his name is, and one of them was really good. They had this. It's a dumb movie, but there was a scene where the woman says that she had prayed to God to bring the family together, and the black guy sits next to him and he goes, you don't think if you prayed to God to bring your family together, he's going to fill you all with a warm, fuzzy feeling and a closeness? Or do you think if you ask God to bring the family together, he's going to present you with an opportunity to bring your family together for you to do it yourself, you know? That's the way I see this now. In this forgiveness, I don't ask God to remove my anger so much as I ask him to help me through this process. We ask God to help us show them the same tolerance, pity, and patience that we would cheerfully grant a sick friend. And this is that fourth step prayer, which I believe is a reference to 6 and 7. When a person offended, we said to ourselves, this is a sick man. How can I be helpful to him? God, save me from being angry. Thy will be done. So now we're bringing into the play here this third person here, this third entity, you might say. Myself, I've brought God in, I've asked him to help me, and now I'm asking to be helpful to this person that I'm angry at. We avoid retaliation or argument. We wouldn't treat sick people that way. If we do, we destroy our chance of being helpful. We cannot be helpful to all people, but at least God will show us how to take a kindly and tolerant view of each and every one. And this next list here, we're going to start there next week, referring to the list again. Now, that's that same list, but we're just going to add to it. And I'll tell you why many people say that this is column 4, and we'll get into that next week. This is not column 4 of the resentment list because there is a different spiritual solution. For the resentment, the spiritual solution is forgiveness, and for the harms done others, the spiritual solution is making amends for those harms done others. That's why this is a different list and not column 4. There's a lot of flyers out there going around too, whatever the Hazelton and all that, and they actually show column 4 and column 5. And this, I am resentful at the cause it affects my, and that's the 3 columns, and they add 2 more. And the reason I've been taught by another man who said the reason this is not column 4 is because he even says, referring to the list again, the reason for that is that there's a different spiritual solution, okay? And what we're doing is we're making columns of things we're going to apply spiritual solutions to. And the spiritual solution of amends is obviously not what I'm angry at. The spiritual solution to anger is not amends, it's forgiveness. So we'll keep referring back to some of these words that we just read all throughout the rest of these steps. So remember how condensed this is. This is really important stuff here. And we will pick up next week at the referring to the list again here in the middle of 67. And we'll open up the floor for 15 minutes of open discussion if anyone would like to ask a question or make a statement or say something or comment on what we've been reading, or you having a bad day or something. Anybody? Who wants to say something? Hey, Brian.
First time in 38 years I've been sober, and still am suffering from alcoholism. I let somebody stay in my house one night, two guys, and the guy that I lent $5 to, he moved out, still hasn't paid me the $5 yet. The other guy's still in there, and he started using again. He was supposed to move on to the 1st. Today's the 3rd, is it?
That's second, actually.
Second, okay. He got his check. Told him this morning, you gotta go. He got out of my freaking house by 4:30. Came home, wasn't gone. All his stuff still in my Florida room, so I packed up all his stuff and I put it out on the porch. Now, I experienced the same thing with all this venting that he was doing about Doug, Painter Doug. Painter Doug stole this and Painter Doug. Well, did you use? Is that what happened last month when you got your check?
Right.
So anyway, it's all about me and not him. I took care of it. I'm not going to use. I just needed to vent. And I came here for a good meeting to learn. I think we're on the 5th step now, but if we're on the 4th, that's okay. And that's it. Cool. Thanks for letting me share.
Yeah, now we got a clear slate now.
Yeah. Thanks, Ricky.
No, thank Doug. Doug's in charge.
Thank you, God.
Okay. Announcements for the good of AA? All right, so last week we left off on step 4, list 2. Remember that, to recap where we've been, we made a decision to turn our lives over to God. And I know some people split hairs when it's not, you don't turn your life over to God, you turn it over to the care of God. I don't know what that means. All I know is I surrendered my life to God, and I said to myself, every minute of the rest of my life is going to be spent in service of God, and I have not had the obsession since. However, untreated alcoholism will creep into your life. Without this resentment list and the harms done others, tonight we're going to do the harms done others list. It's on page 67, about halfway down the page, referring to the list again.
Which column is that?
This is not a column, this is a list. The first list had 3 columns in it. And I know what you're saying, that there is a flyer going around from Hazleton or the Big Book Seminar, and they call this column 4 and 5. But I'll tell you why it's not column 4 and 5. What the man taught me, he said, the reason this is not a part of your resentment list, even though he says referring to the list again, what he's saying here is referring to the list again, you're going to get the names off of that list of the people that you had hurt. And the reason being that this is a different list is because there's a different spiritual solution to be applied to it. We have 4 separate lists, but 3 spiritual solutions. Actually, we have 4, but step 5 is sort of a step in all itself. You know, it's the admission to God, to ourselves, and to another human being is to a spiritual solution. But these spiritual solutions that we're looking at outlined in the 4th step, actually step 5 is outlined in this paragraph right here. Step 5 and step 8 are also referenced in this paragraph here. So we're going to read this paragraph, and in the middle of the page here, he says, referring to the list again. So what you would do is turn back to the page before this on 65. And you're going to see the names on that list. And he's only got 4 names there. Mr. Brown, Mrs. Jones, my employer, and my wife. And both the sponsors I had were a little different. The first sponsor I had said, write everybody's name down. Write down your mother and your father, and you said, don't sit around and think about how angry you are or what you were angry about, or just write down all their names first. The family members, brother, sister, cousins, uncles, ex-girlfriends, ex-wives, wives, girlfriends, whatever. All those people. Also, along with cops, politics, religion, race, government, stuff like that. Anything that you could be angry about. My second sponsor said, just write down what you're angry about right now. If there's any anger that you're carrying around right now, you got to get rid of that anger. That's the point behind this. The point is that if you have any anger in your life at any given time, that you have to apply the spiritual solution to that. And the spiritual solution is not make a list and then walk away from it. The spiritual solution is at the top of this page 67. We went over that last week. We will refer to the spiritual solution of forgiveness repeatedly throughout the rest of the steps also. Actually, step 6 and 7 is, remember we went over this last week, although he's in this paragraph, he's talking about how to forgive, and he's given us almost 2 whole paragraphs on how to forgive. What that is a reference to step 6 and 7. And you can easily see that by thinking, what step is it that I ask God to remove my anger? What step is it that I ask God to remove my character defects or shortcomings, whatever? He says something different in each one of them steps, but he's talking about the same exact thing. He's talking about this anger. How do I get rid of this anger? Through forgiveness in step 6 and 7, along with the admission in step 5 and the list of step 4. All of these things come together to become our spiritual solution. And remember that a spiritual solution includes all 3 of these aspects: ourselves, another human being, and God. If God's not in there, if it's just you and somebody else, it's a human solution. It is not a spiritual solution. We have to have God's help. Remember what he said last week when we were reading step 3 a couple of weeks ago, is we could not reduce our self-centeredness much by wishing or trying on our own power. We have to have God's help. We can. Sure.
Before we go any further now, like you said, you bracket those 3 things. What about an atheist? How would you work with an atheist, not kind of agnostic kind of guy? Like your three things you just listed.
Yeah.
You got yourself an atheist, an agnostic, or whatever. What would you substitute?
Well,
If anything, a spirit, an unknown entity, or how would you explain it? How would you do it?
Most of the people in the chapter, we agnostics, is a lot of stuff in there. There's a lot of details. And what the chapter we agnostics says is that they became converts, is that they used to be agnostics. They used to be atheists. So the idea is all that is required is that you become willing to believe that there's something there and pray to whatever it is you think is there. You know, most of the people that I've come across, Angelo, really do believe that there's some power. It's the word, it's that 3-letter word, God or religion, that they're really struggling with. And they somehow they don't make a separation between that.
That's what I've run into.
Yeah.
And trying to explain to them,
Well, here's what a man told me was, have them pray to whatever they think is there. No matter, they got to believe that they have to be willing to believe that there's something there, or we can't work with them. Because something like okay. But the idea is that if you do the steps the way that they're outlined and ask whatever it is that you believe may or may not be there, you will get to results. That through the process of working the steps, most people do, and I have to admit, part of my recovery has been in hindsight. I look back on it and say, wow, something has happened here. You can't deny it. So that's what I explain to other people and that's what in the I think it was the chapter There Is a Solution. He mentions the bridge of reason does not lead to the land of faith. That you must take the action, you must take the leap of faith in order to get it. If you contempt prior to investigation, if you go, well, that shit ain't gonna work for me, without even trying it, then there's no hope for you. But if you give it a shot, that's what I tell them. I've only run into like one atheist person in all the years I've been working with people. And there's, like I said, several people I've had, though, do say, I don't know if there's anything there or not. I say, well, we just keep working. But I've only had one guy who actually said he was an atheist. Hey, Jim.
I kind of had
Yeah. Well, something that you should not miss is that there are spiritual solutions and there are directions on how to apply these things. Like we read last week, I don't know if you were here, but the top paragraph on this page is the how to forgive. It's precise directions on how to forgive another person. And yeah. It's primarily, it's first you have to recognize the anger. You have to write it down on a piece of paper. You have to share it with another human being in step 5. You have to, what does he say here? He says, we realize that the people who wronged us were perhaps spiritually sick. So part of this is my perception of these people that I'm angry with. That's one of the things that I've been trying to explain to people over the years is that over the years I've been applying this forgiveness, and today I see everybody like a lost child in Walmart running through the aisles screaming for his mommy. Only it's not mommy anymore, it's God. And that's the way I perceive everybody. No matter how big and strong or together they seem, that's just the way I see everybody now. Because I don't know how to, I don't know. Like he says here, we realize that the people who wronged us were perhaps spiritually sick, and they, like ourselves, were sick too. It's just a simple matter of I see everybody just like me. They don't have the courage to admit that they're without God I am nothing. That was Bill Wilson's words.
So like if I had a problem today that needed to be addressed because
Of anger. And don't forget the part where you ask God to help. He says many people refer to this as the 4th step prayer, but like I said, that's not the way I learned it. The 4th step prayer says asking God to help me from being angry, but if you'll look, step 7 is the step where you ask God to remove these things. So throughout these pages of the 4th step, he's constantly making references to other steps, like where he says, we admitted our wrongs honestly and we're willing to set these matters straight. That's a reference to step 8. We admitted our wrongs honestly is step 5. Willing to set these matters straight, step 8. We turn our attention to helping others. We ask him to remove our fear and direct our attention to what he would have us be. That's a reference to step 12. Over here he says, we treat sex as we would any other problem. In meditation, we ask God. That's step 11. In meditation, asking God. All throughout the pages of this 4th step here, he's explaining to us how the other steps interact with the 4th step inventory. Is how you're not just making a list of what you're angry about. You have to face these things and to be rid of them. And the spiritual solutions are the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. Well, this is the way I've understood it, Jim. It's not like I'm going to explain to you the spiritual solution and voila, you got it. This is something you got to practice, like some guy who plays baseball for a living. They got to practice every day. And through the process of practicing these spiritual principles in all your affairs, you're going to intuitively know how to handle these situations which used to baffle you. Which, you know what you can understand that the way I understood it from what the psychiatrists say is that what we're dealing with here are things that are operating below the level of conscious thought. Okay, let's say that you are angry, and and you're like a rageaholic, and you're screaming at everybody. Did you make a conscious decision to become that person? No, you are reacting to what's happening to you in your life. Turning back to the list where we just came from, that's 3rd column where he says, you were just mentioning columns. The 3rd column says that it affects my sex relations, self-esteem, security. It's rooted in fear. Bracketed alongside every word is the word fear there. And you have to know that no one makes a conscious decision to do these things. What we're saying is that I have never learned through the process of growing up or the people that I was around, I never learned how to deal with anger through forgiveness. My solution to anger was a heated exchange, usually followed by some kind of physical confrontation or another. That was my way of dealing with anger. I never knew how to forgive. I never knew that forgiveness was the key to being free of anger. Yeah.
Because I was so.
You know what may help you, Jim, too, is to know that your anger is rooted in fear. Whatever it was you were angry about, that was, you know what I see today? I see the most angry person I can find, and I see the most afraid person. I don't see anger anger today is fear. You remember what I was telling you about the kid running through Walmart yelling for mommy?
Yeah. To pay this bill or do this or do that.
know that fear is the driving force behind the obsession for the first drink. Fear is the spiritual sickness that we have. Fear is the driving force behind the obsession for the first drink. When you say, out of nowhere comes this obsession for that first drink, and I can't combat it. It just like a robot. I head for it, and I take a drink, and that's it. Or fill in the blank. You know, I take a pill, I smoke a whatever. You know, but here's the thing: is it's important to understand that this fear is not something that we make a conscious decision to do. No one sits down and goes, man, I'm going to be scared about this. That's what I'm going to do. Once again, you are running on an instinct for self-preservation, and this instinct for self-preservation is the root cause of that obsession for that first one. And you just have to trust that when people that have been here before you say that this fear is also rooted in self. All fear is based in self, and we get out of self by doing for others and not expecting in return. That is the whole program. Is we're gonna write down. This is the number one manifestation, the most common manifestation of anger of self right here, as he puts it. Remember, were you here last week? I don't remember. Remember the words that we use in the middle of the page on 64. He says we did exactly the same thing with our lives. We took stock honestly. First, we searched out the flaws in our makeup which caused our failure to do God's will in the first place. Here in step 3, you made a decision to surrender to turn your life over to God. Okay, what's been keeping you from doing that? He says we're gonna search out the flaws in our makeup which caused our failure to do God's will in the first place, and being convinced that self manifested in various ways was what had defeated us, we considered its common manifestations. This anger and the fear and the guilt that you have when we get to this list we're getting to today, these are the primary things that block us from God. And from these 3, if you'll read in this next paragraph here, he says resentment is the number 1 offender. It destroys more alcoholics than anything else, and from it stem all forms of spiritual disease. So we don't have to look for hundreds of defects of character or shortcomings or whatever you want to call them. We're only looking for these 3 because from these 3 stem all forms of spiritual disease. You understand that? So essentially what I've learned over the years is why this is short and sweet, and it's not this long, drawn-out, complicated list that I see some people coming up with these days. You know, a life story, if you would. You know, it even says life story when you get to the 5th step, but you can clearly see that that's not what this is. But back to where we were, we're looking at this step 4 list 2, okay? There are 4 lists in the 4th step of these most common manifestations of self, okay? And it's important to know that what we were just talking about, that no one makes a conscious decision to... Many of the harms that we're going to see in this list were done out of fear, out of self, okay? That I was afraid for myself in some form or another, and because of that, I stole from people that I cared about. I did things, and I said things that hurt the people that I cared about, and I never really wanted to do that. I did it because out of my addiction or my alcoholism. But anyway, back to this. He says, referring to that list again, the same list that we just made with all those names, putting out of our minds the wrongs others had done, we resolutely look for our own mistakes. Now, we got these questions here that we're going to be answering. And these are not like yes and no questions. These are questions that are meant to be answered with an answer, or not like an actual, imperative answer with some kind of meat and potatoes to it. Not, yes, I was angry, or yes, I was selfish. And he asked these questions. For each one of those names, you're going to say, where had I been selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, and frightened? So you're going to look for where you were dishonest. Where did you lie to any of these people? Did you steal from them? Did you unjustifiably arouse jealousy? That's out in the list of harms done others sexually. Now, the harms done others sexually, which would be like your wives, ex-wives, girlfriends, ex-girlfriends, would be, this list in a couple of pages. So you're going to leave those off of this list. It doesn't actually tell you that, but as we read through the next page, you'll see that the women are on a separate list. And the reason that I'm told that it was a separate list was because that they're the closest relationships that we'll have in our lives. Like you live with a woman for, 8 or 10 years, but you worked for that guy for 3 months when you took his tools or something like that. So it's a different category altogether. Okay, so these are the questions you answer. Where had we been selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, and frightened? Though a situation had not been entirely our fault, we tried to disregard the other person involved entirely. Now remember that the reason that this is not column 4 and 5, and I've seen those lists, I've been around a while, those lists, they fail to take into consideration the spiritual solutions. And I have seen those lists make a reference to forgiveness, but they fail to point out the importance of it. It's almost like they mention the way to forgiveness as I don't know, sort of lackadaisically, half-assed, whatever you want to. They really don't stress the importance of that like I do, because I mean, it seems to me that the most important thing we're trying to do here is the application of these spiritual solutions in our life every day. Forgiveness, making amends, and faith in God, and the admission in step 5. These are the most important things in our lives. And without that, I mean, what's the point of the inventory? It says clearly we got to face these things that are blocking us from God, and we have to be rid of these things that are blocking us from God. So making the list, I can't tell you how many years I was in sobriety when I thought the 4th step was just you write it down and you tell it to somebody, and it was magically, whoof, there it went. It was gone, They were just...
Actually, it's like an abscess on your ass. It just keeps reoccurring.
Yeah. But the 5th step is not the only solution to these problems. We have to apply forgiveness. Anyway, so we tried to disregard the other person involved entirely. Where were we to blame? That's like the 5th question in that. See a question mark there? The inventory was ours, not the other man's. When we saw our faults, we listed them. We placed them before us in black and white. Now, that's the end of that list. So it's pretty simple. You're going to, on this step 4 list 2, you're going to refer to that same list again and take the names off of that list of the people that some of those people may not be on this list. Everybody that you're angry with may not be somebody, because down at the bottom of the page here, he does make a reference to part of this solution to this anger is to see that maybe they were retaliating against us for something that we had done. And although that's not the idea, that's not the path of forgiveness, it's easier to forgive them just to see when they're just they're doing the same thing we're doing. They're feeling threatened by somebody else and afraid for themselves, and they retaliate. So here's the reference to step 5 I was just mentioning. We admitted our wrongs honestly. That's a reference to step 5. And we're willing to set these matters straight. That's a reference to step 8. Where he just says we're willing to set these matters straight. He doesn't say then we went out and set them straight. That's a reference to step 9, which that reference to step 9 is in here. It's a couple of pages over here. So this next paragraph is a transitional paragraph between the 2 lists that we had just come from, the resentment list and the harms done others list. And remember that there's a difference between why are these lists separated like this? Because there's a different spiritual solution to be applied to this particular, as he puts it, most common manifestation of self. The most common manifestation of self that is anger, the number 1 is forgiveness, is the spiritual solution to be applied to that. And when we make a list of the harms that we had done others, we're looking to get to the guilt that we have associated with lying, cheating, stealing, and doing things that hurt other people. So there's a different spiritual solution to this list, and that is the 9th step, amends, step 8 and 9. When we make amends for these harms that we had done these other people, we are free of the guilt. And once again, remember that no one makes a conscious decision to get angry. It's an almost instantaneous reaction to being threatened by something someone else is doing. It's as I learned, it's an instinct that operates below the level of conscious thought. And we're trying to get to that conscious thought in the back of that. You're trying to get into the subconscious human. That's one of the things that the psychiatrists write about in that book, Comes of Age. There's a lot of good. There's only about 10 or 12 pages in there, but it's a lot of good stuff in there. And Bill Wilson even wrote, he said that the psychiatrist, or the study of the inner workings of the subconscious human mind plays a vital role to Alcoholics Anonymous. And what he's saying, and in that statement there, the study of the inner workings of the subconscious human mind is saying, is why do I react with anger and I have no control over it? I don't know if you guys have seen anybody who's like a real rageaholic. You can see that they are out of control and they have no control over this anger. Why is it that it just out of nowhere comes the inner workings of my subconscious mind sets me off? And the same thing with this fear and the guilt, okay? Nobody makes a conscious decision to feel guilty for what you've done. It's just the way it is. It's part of this subconscious human mind that we're trying to reteach. And I always make a reference to that one quick little statement in the 9th Step Promises where he says that we will intuitively know how to handle situations which used to baffle us. There rises the question, here you are in the 9th step, and there's this promise of the 9th step that says we will intuitively know how to handle situations which used to baffle us. You can ask that question, what situations is he talking about? He's talking about the guilt that you feel for having harmed other people. That, you know, when I first got sober, if you'd have flat out asked me, do you feel any guilt for stealing and doing the things that you did to those people, I'd have said, probably not. I don't know. I don't think I do. I believe some of the people had it coming. To hell with them, you know, something along those lines. But the truth of the matter is, you don't make a conscious decision to feel guilty. If you do something that hurts somebody, you feel guilty, and that's all there is to it. Unless you're like some kind of sociopath or something. And I believe there are some true sociopaths in this world who have little or no care for what they do. But for myself, there is guilt involved in when I harm other people. So I must make amends to these people. And many of these amends are a lifetime of amends. But anyway, back to what we were getting at here was the spiritual solution in this second list is for making amends for the harms that we had done others. And then we got another spiritual solution for this next list that's coming up. The spiritual solution to the fear list, which we're coming up on here, is faith in God. Okay, now you see how the reason we're not calling these part of the same, you know, column 5, column 6, column 7. There's only 3 columns that he has on the resentment list. And once again, I'm making a reference to that flyer that a lot of you guys have probably seen out there at some point or another, where they actually call this paragraph that we just read, column 4 and 5, of the resentment list. And I was told by another man, a smart man, I believe, that says this is not column 4 and 5. And you can clearly see that because on that other page there is no column 4 and 5, okay? That last column says that it affects my, and then he has the fear of bracketed alongside each one of those fears that he has, resentments that he has. Now, the reason for this fear thing is it's important to see that, remember back to the statement we just made, that fear is the driving force behind the obsession for the first drink. When out of nowhere comes the obsession in the back of my mind that says, you can have one this time. Hey, you've been good. It's been 2 weeks. Or somebody plops down an ice cold beer on a hot day and I reach for it and don't think twice about it. Where does that come from? That comes from fear. And that's why we're making these lists. That this next paragraph is a statement that says that all anger is based in fear. When he's telling us, notice that the word fear is bracketed alongside the difficulties with Mr. Brown, Mrs. Jones, the employer, and the wife. He's essentially saying, go back to the, what's up, buddy?
I have a question. You said that someone puts down an ice cold beer on a hot day, but you're not angry. I mean, maybe I'm missing something here, but I'm not angry. It's just a hot cold day, and automatically, by instinct, I pick it up and just shove it down that beer. But I'm not angry. It was just a hot day. No.
Yeah. Well, once again, this list we're reading right now, this paragraph we're reading right now is telling us that there is a driving force behind that anger, too. Fear is the driving force behind that anger. Turn back to the page, turn back to that list we just came from. And look at the list where he says, I am resentful at Mr. Brown. The cause of the resentment is that he's paying attention to my wife. He told my wife and my mistress, and Brown may get my job at my office. And it affects remember, this is what we're saying here, is no one makes a conscious decision to get angry or be afraid. He is essentially saying that it's affecting his sex relations and his self-esteem, and it is rooted in fear. That fear is the driving force behind the resentment that he has at Mr. Brown. He's afraid he's going to get his wife, and he may get his job at the office, too. This guy, this Mr. Brown fellow, is going to take literally half his life away right here, his job and his wife right off the... And then what? Then he looks down here and he says that he's angry with Mrs. Jones because she had her husband committed, and he's my friend. She's a gossip. And at some point there, he's afraid of something that some power that this woman has over him. It's affecting his personal relationships.
How does that relate to transcending to just unconsciously? Okay, let me rephrase that.
Right, I
Just subconsciously reaching for a cold beer, but if you had this instilled in your mind, that would never present itself. Is that correct? That idea.
Well, from
You short for it. That's I guess when you
From what I understand,
even though it's a hot day, the ice cold
Yeah.
beer, you say, hey, wait a minute, I can't go there.
well, here's the thing that I'm getting at. You can say I can't go there, and like I say a lot is, I made a firm resolution and a decision to never take another drink as long as I live, and I drank anyway.
So be a
You
hot
understand
sunny
that?
Day, the ice cold beer, hey man, here's a beer.
Yeah, but here's what I'm telling you is, there is a driving force behind when you, it's almost like a blackout. For me, it was like a blackout. I would look down and see a beer in my hand and go, holy crap, I'm drunk again. How did this happen? You understand that? I never actually, some people say, well, I made a decision to go get drunk. Well, then you and I are at different places in our recovery, because I made a decision, a firm resolve. I swore on my own life that I was not going to take another drink, and I was drunk. It didn't matter. You understand? And what I'm saying here, what they're saying here is that fear is painful. To live a life of being afraid, now that I know that this resentment is based in fear, and the harms that I had done others was out of fear, and I'm looking now at the fears list. We're getting into the fears list here. What we're saying here is, if you live a life that is full of fear, it's a painful life, and that you can anesthetize that pain with alcohol. Alcohol is a painkiller. It's a great, what do they call it? The great... Essentially what you're doing is you're anesthetizing the pain of all that fear that you're feeling. Because once again, no one's making a decision to be afraid, okay? And back to the how it works, where he says, usually those who are constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves. For me, what that meant was, when I looked at this, I said, you know what? I think they're right. It's this fear that's driving me. And then I get somebody that I'm working with, and they go, oh, I ain't got no fear. No, this ain't me. And then a week later, they're drunk. And I see right off the bat, I go, I was capable of saying that I believe this. And I believe that this fear is at the root of my obsession. I was an angry person when I came in. I was a screaming demon. I used to yell. I had a job where I had like 15 guys that were working under me. And I thought it was my job to scream at every one of them as much as I could every day. Little did I know, I looked like a maniac out there, you know. But anyway, back to this. Notice that the word fear, this paragraph is telling us, it's a transitional paragraph between the resentment list, the harms done others list, and the fears list, okay? So think of this paragraph as a sort of an intermediate paragraph between anger, guilt, and fear paragraphs here. He's saying this short word somehow touches about every aspect of our lives. It is an evil and corroding thread. The fabric of our existence was shot through with it. It set in motion trains of circumstances which brought us misfortune we felt we didn't deserve. But did not we ourselves set the ball rolling? Now, remember what he said at the beginning of that paragraph. Notice that the word fear is bracketed alongside the difficulties. He's essentially telling us that all this anger that we felt is really just the most noticeable form of fear in our lives. If the grouch and the brainstorm were the terms that he used on this other page, where he says, the grouch and the brainstorm were not for us. They may be the dubious luxury of normal men, but for alcoholics these things are poison. Essentially what he's saying is that the more angry that I am when I'm screaming at somebody, the more afraid I am, because this anger is rooted in fear. It is the driving force. Huh?
In other words, you encompass fear is a million different definitions. Forms of it.
Yeah, but we're going to stick to these three primary forms that we're saying here, on the premise that from these three stem all the other subforms. And by bringing these three under control with these three spiritual solutions that we have, all the other subforms of self will follow and be into their right place, on the premise that they stem from these three. From anger, guilt, and fear stem all the other subforms of self, he says. From it stem all forms of spiritual disease at the beginning of the resentment list. Okay? So, sometimes we think fear ought to be classed with stealing. It seems to cause more trouble. Now, he's not very clear on the fears list, other than to say that we put them on paper. And this little paragraph that he gives us in this fears list, the way that I've experienced it and reading some of the other literature, is that what he's doing here is, at the time there was a lot of psychiatrists working with alcoholics, okay? And the psychiatrists failed to sober up any alcoholics. And this paragraph is a sort of a reference to the way that psychiatrists were trying to work with alcoholics at the time. You see what he says here, we'll read the paragraph, and I'll do my best to explain it from where I understand it. He says, we reviewed our fears thoroughly. We put them on paper. Now, obviously, that's pretty clear, putting them on paper and not thought about it in our head, okay?
68 on the top.
68 at the top, the fears list. We've just finished that transitional paragraph about all anger being, okay? And he says, we reviewed our fears thoroughly. We put them on paper. And many people I've heard in the past said that this is a reference to that anger, that resentment list, okay? And even, he says right here, he says, even though we had no resentment in connection with them. So stop right there with that period and stop and take a look at that sentence that we just read. He's saying we reviewed our fears thoroughly. We put them on paper, even though we had no resentment in connection with them. So this is a completely separate list from that resentment list. This is a separate list from the harms done others list. And essentially, the way I learned to make this list was to just write down what it is that you're afraid of. And it's the same thing for everybody. I'm afraid of getting drunk. I'm afraid of getting sick. I'm afraid of dying. I'm afraid of being alone. I'm afraid of getting old. I'm afraid of being broke. I'm afraid of being homeless. Those are the same fears that all human beings have for self-preservation, almost. Remember, in the 12 and 12, he speaks a lot of instincts in there. And Bill Wilson does make a big reference to the fact that we're talking about instincts that are controlling our lives instead of us trying to control our instincts, which is essentially what we're trying to do here. By making a list of these things, we're going to teach ourselves subconsciously how to deal with anger in the future. And for me, this is how it looks. For me, I used to, if somebody did something that made me angry, like I said, we'd get in some kind of verbal exchange, usually followed by some kind of physical confrontation, and that was the way that I dealt with anger. But I will intuitively know how to handle situations which used to baffle me means that over the period of time I find things that I'm angry about, I apply the spiritual solution to forgiveness, and I practice that principle in all my affairs of forgiveness when I'm angry, and then over the period of time I will learn how to deal with that anger, and subconsciously. I won't have to stop and think, like this is, early on I had to go, oh, I'm angry, I got to put this on paper, and I got to apply forgiveness to it. You understand what I'm saying? I'm doing this action. But over the period of time, weeks, months, years, decades, it becomes a second nature. I teach my subconscious mind how to deal with that anger through forgiveness without having to stop and say, oh, I'm angry. I got to write this down, share it with another human being and God, apply the spiritual solution of forgiveness, turn my attention to helping others and thinking of others. It becomes a second nature. You understand what I'm saying there? When he says that we will intuitively know how to handle these situations, that is a reference to practicing these principles and teaching my subconscious mind, which before now has been undisciplined. My subconscious mind, when somebody threatens me, goes off the deep end, and I'm angry, and I'm out of control. But now I'm going to learn how to control this thing and teach my subconscious mind how to handle these situations. And so, too, with this fear here. With this fears list, remember, the fears list is a simple, I'm afraid of dying, I'm afraid of being broke, I'm afraid of being homeless. So here we are, he says, and this second half of this paragraph is a reference to what the psychiatrists had taken alcoholics to a certain point, and they couldn't help us anymore. That's when Bill Wilson picks up and says that's when we bring in religion. Alcoholics Anonymous is born of psychiatry, religion, and medicine. Medicine, like Silkworth, taught us that, the fatal nature of our disease, that we have an allergy, we develop the obsession, and once we take that first drink, we get that allergy that sets up, and there's no other way of looking at it. And then psychiatry brings us to this part here where he says, this is part of one of the things that he says, we asked ourselves why we had them. So that's a simple question. I ask myself, why do I have these fears? But then he answers the question right behind it. He says, he's not asking you to answer the question with the fears that you've written down, because he's giving you the answer right behind it here. He says, we asked ourselves why we had these fears. Wasn't it because self-reliance failed us? Self-reliance was good as far as it went, but it didn't go far enough. Some of us once had great self-confidence, but it didn't fully solve the fear problem or any other. When it made us cocky, it was worse. So from my experience, that's a reference to the fact that, I think psychiatry was like 100 years old or something at the time Bill wrote this. It had been about 100 years, and which is relatively new, you might say, as far as like medicine might go.
Did the Oxford group get into religion?
Yeah, I think Bill had made a reference to the absolutes that nobody was, if they did, they were lying, and that was dishonesty. Yeah. Yeah, absolute purity, absolute honesty, and that's why he says we claim spiritual progress, not spiritual perfection. But anyway.
So they were prescribing medicine then? Psychiatrists were prescribing medicine?
Bill Wilson did LSD in sobriety. In Bill's story, Pass It On, he spent several years on LSD.
No, I didn't know that one either.
Dude, LSD was a psychotropic drug where they said, like today, they got Prozac and whatever the other stuff is. They go, here, try this, try that. You know,
Then they give Xanax too to calm him down besides. Yeah.
well, that was LSD when it was originally developed. Was the psychiatrists were trying it, and it worked on quite a few people too.
Did it obviously work
Hey.
on him? though?
Gary Grant, all these guys.
Did it work on him?
Yeah, Bill says he had an immense spiritual experience from it. Yeah.
Fuck, so would I.
Well, and remember, it was not a drug. It was
mind-altering drug at that time.
until 1973 was when they classed all those drugs illegal. It was President Nixon that made Class A, Class B, and Class C drugs, and before that, that was almost up in the air as to whether it was illegal or not. Yeah, Nixon. It was Nixon that said that the Class A is over the counter, Class B is prescription, and Class C is of no medical purpose whatsoever.
You're telling me
This
that
is the ones that we all did.
LSD was you couldn't get pop selling LSD?
Well, you couldn't get pop-
The doctors were prescribing it.
prescribing it.
The psychiatrists were prescribing it to their
Like, now
patients to
they're
help them.
Prescribing marijuana, and
Oh, yeah.
depending on the patient's.
Marijuana's already been classed as a no useful purpose whatsoever, a Class C. Yeah. But anyway, back to so these next two paragraphs. You know what? We'll get to these next two paragraphs next week. It's a reference to step 12, and it's a reference to faith in God, and we'll try to finish up these couple of pages after this next week. Anyway.
Stopping it perhaps then?
Yeah, perhaps there's a better way, which is this whole next two paragraphs is how to have faith in God, or a reference to step 12, chapter 7, working with others. Okay. All right, so this is our Big Book meeting, and we're on page 68 tonight. I'm an alcoholic. My name's Doug. My sobriety date is August 17th, 1990. A little over 20 years, 3 months, 4 months, something like that. All right, so page 68 is knee-deep into the fourth step. The fourth step begins on page 64 and goes to page 71. 7 pages make up the fourth step. And to review where we've been the last couple of weeks, page 64 at the top tells us that our liquor was but a symptom. Our liquor was but a symptom, so we had to get down to the causes and conditions. And this fourth step is a strenuous effort to face and to be rid of the things in ourselves which had been blocking us from God's will. Remember, we're going to jump back a step and look at the third step and say, okay, you made a decision to turn your will and your life over to the care of God. And what the fourth step is a search to find what it is that's keeping you from doing God's will. Okay? If you'll look at that third paragraph down from the top, he's going to tell us. He says, in reference to this inventory, that the guy who owns a business has to take an inventory of what's on the shelves in order to have a successful business, he says, we did exactly the same thing with our lives. We took stock honestly, and first we searched out the flaws in our makeup, which caused our failure. Caused our failure to do what? To do God's will in the first place. We made a decision to do God's will is a pretty much an acknowledgement that we haven't been doing God's will up to that point. Okay, so we're going to search out the flaws in our makeup, which caused our failure to do God's will in the first place. And now he says, being convinced that self manifested in various ways, and we have been looking at the different ways of self that he has outlined with us. Anger is the number one form of selfish, self-centered behavior. We looked at that a couple of weeks ago. Guilt is one of the top 3 forms of selfish, self-centered behavior. If you'll look at the next paragraph down, he says that, and this is the idea behind why we're only going to be looking at these three things, okay? And there may be hundreds of defects of character. There may be hundreds of shortcomings out there for us to have in our lives. But as alcoholics and our recovery system here, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on these three primary, and this is what he calls them in this paragraph, the third paragraph from the top on 64. Being convinced that self manifested in various ways was what had defeated us, we considered its common manifestations. So what we're looking for in the fourth step are, we find that there are three of them as we look through here. We are looking for the three most common manifestations of self that block us from receiving and doing God's will. Now that we've made a decision to do God's will, that is what the moral inventory is. The words moral inventory had me stumped for some time, and I was too embarrassed to tell anybody. So I find it important to throw that out there, that it was just a college word that he used, a moral inventory. He could have said an inventory of the most common manifestations of self, because that's what it says here. We're looking for the most common manifestations of self that block us from a life of self-sacrifice for others. Remember, back in Bill's story is where he gave us the most clear definition of what we think God's will is for us. And it may take many variations, but the general idea, the general basic idea that God's will is that we live our life in sacrifice of others and do things for others and expect nothing in return. That's the key to sobriety, is thinking of my life as from this point on as being lived in sacrifice for others. I have no other reason to live except to do what God wants me to do, which is to think and do things for others without expecting in return. So what's keeping me from doing that is, a couple of weeks ago we went over resentment or anger. Anger is the number one, and what I was getting at a minute ago is where he says, from this anger, fear, and guilt stem all other forms of spiritual disease. And what we're going to be seeing here is we're not just looking to find these things that block us from God. We have actual spiritual solutions that we're going to apply to them, okay? And a couple of weeks ago we went over anger. We make a list of what we're angry about, and we apply the spiritual solution to anger. And the difference between a spiritual solution and a human solution is that we bring all three of these aspects into play. Ourselves, God, and another human being, all three of those aspects are required for it to be a spiritual solution. If there's only you and the person involved and there's no God, then it's a human solution. If it's only taking place in your head and not manifesting in the actions in your life, and action is a part of each one of these too. Our spiritual solutions require action. Forgiveness. You say, how does forgiveness have action? Number one, I'll tell you what. It's only like 2 paragraphs. The paragraph for forgiveness is on page 66 at the bottom. I'm going to read for about half the meeting. We'll open up the floor for open discussion. I don't want to sit up here and it doesn't do my ego any good either to ramble on all the time. But anyway, at the bottom of page 66, one of the things that Bill Wilson did here was he tells us what the problem is, and then immediately he tells us what the solution is. But this is the 4th step, and it's in the 7th step that we ask God to remove these defects of character. So essentially what you're seeing here is a reference to the 7th step, okay? It's out in step 7 that we're going to ask God to help us be free of that anger and apply the spiritual solution. But here is one of the most clear. Many people refer to this as the 4th step prayer, but it's not. If you'll stop and think about it, it doesn't take but a relatively intelligent person to say it's not in the 4th step that I ask God to remove my defects of characters. It's clearly stated in steps 6 and 7, the 2 steps. 6 is get ready for 7, 7 is do 7. 8 is get ready for 9, 9 is do 9. There's really nothing to do in them. We'll get to that when we get there. But this is how to forgive when you're angry. At the bottom of the page, he says, we saw these resentments must be mastered, but how? We could not wish them away any more than alcohol. So essentially what he's saying here is when I'm angry, I have to have God's help to get rid of this. I could not wish this away any more than alcohol. And I remember, I tried to wish alcohol away for several years, and it didn't work. I mean, if you guys are real alcoholics like me, you know that what we're saying here is if you're angry, and this anger is dominating your life, you can't just sit down somewhere and go, oh, that's it, I'm not going to be angry anymore. Any more than you could say, well, that's it, I'm not going to drink anymore. You are powerless to get rid of this anger. We could not wish them away any more than alcohol. This was our course. So he's telling us how to get rid of anger here, which is the most important thing in our lives. If anger is the number one form of selfish, self-centered behavior, and getting rid of that anger is the number one thing we need to do here, this was our course. Okay, and there's like a 3 or 4 part process here. I'm going to stick with 4 because sometimes I change the way, just reading it, you'll see. Number 1, we realized that the people who wronged us were perhaps spiritually sick. So part of that process is writing it down and seeing it on paper. I realize, and one of the things he does too, he repeatedly tells us we turn back to the list, for it held the key to our future freedom from alcoholism. So having done that, you can turn, hypothetically, let's say you're sitting there with your 4th step in your hand and you're saying, okay, so I've listed that I'm angry with my mother or my father or my brother or something, something big, someone close. How can I get rid of this anger? Well, first of all, get the list out and look at it in your hands and say, we realize that the people who wronged us were perhaps spiritually sick. Though we did not like their symptoms and the way these disturbed us, they, like ourselves, were sick too. So that's like the first part. You see, he's got a period right there. Stop and look at the people as if they, just like I am, they're spiritually sick. They're trying to find their way in life. So turn back to the list over there and you see Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown is paying attention to his wife. He's angry with Mr. Brown because he's paying attention to his wife, and it affects his sex relations and self-esteem. So what he's done now is he sees that this guy, obviously, what kind of a spiritually fit man would pay attention to another man's wife, Exactly. I can see that this guy, and every one of our resentments will be seen in this light. You're going to see, number one, that these people, a lot of them are retaliating for something that I've done, and many of them are just like me. They're sick too. So here's this little 4th step prayer many people refer to this as, and I don't refer to, I used to too. I used to refer to this as the 4th step prayer until one day it dawned on me. I said, that's not the step where you ask God to remove it. It's 6 and 7, because within these pages he makes reference to all the other steps. He makes references to when we admitted our wrongs and we were willing to set these matters straight, and then he makes a reference out in the sex inventory to meditation, and that's step 11. He makes a reference to we admitted our wrongs honestly. That's step 5. But anyway, here is, we ask God, in step 6 and 7, we ask God to help us show them the same tolerance, pity, and patience we would cheerfully grant a sick friend. So here's part 2. Part 1 is I see them in the same light that I am. I'm spiritually sick, and I'm not well, obviously. So I see them as no longer this perfect person, that I did see them as, and it's easier to forgive them. And then I ask God to help me. I say, God, please help me to forgive this person, and show them the same tolerance, pity, and patience we would cheerfully grant a sick friend. When a person offended, we said to ourselves, this is a sick man, how can I be helpful to him? So that's the 3rd part there. How can I be helpful to him? That's the action part. Is the person, you've got to turn back to this list and say, well, how can I be helpful to Mr. Brown? He's paying attention to my wife. He might get my job at the office, and I got to try to be helpful to this guy to be free of my anger. I see him as if he's perhaps spiritually sick. I ask God to help me remove the anger from me, and how can I be of help to that person? We avoid retaliation or argument. We wouldn't treat sick people that way. If we do, we destroy our chance of being helpful. We cannot be helpful to all people, but at least God will help. God will show us how to take a kindly and tolerant view of each and every one. So you understand that this is spiritual solutions. We have 3 of them in Alcoholics Anonymous. And like I said, I'm still wrestling with it. Number 4 may be step 5, admitting our wrongs. It's all 3 parts come into the step 5 in this admission. And so forgiveness, making amends, faith in God, and admission are all 4 essential parts of our program of recovery in Alcoholics Anonymous. And they all bring into play the spiritual solutions of all the 3 aspects. Myself, God, and another human being come into play in each one of these spiritual solutions, along with action. All of these, anyway. Today we are at the fears inventory. And I know I didn't bring up the harms done others, but we're going to get to the harms done others part 2, which is harms done others sexually here tonight, hopefully, if we don't get past this Fear's inventory. And then last week we went over to fear's inventory. He simply says, write down the things that you're afraid of. And why are we breaking down these lists into four, and why isn't it just one big list and then we apply the solutions to it? Because each one of these lists, there are 4 different lists because there are 3 lists. The sex inventory is broken into 2, harms done others and harms done others sexually. But there are different spiritual solutions to each one of these. There's a spiritual solution to anger, and that spiritual solution is forgiveness. There's a spiritual solution to fear. The spiritual solution to fear is faith in God. And the spiritual solution to guilt or harms done others, which brings about the guilt, and the guilt is what blocks us from God, and that's why we make a list of harms done others, and we did that we went over that last week. But there's different spiritual solution to each one of these, and the reason I said that is because there have been flyers out there, like these recovery places, Hazelton or sober houses or whatever. They're handing out little 4th step flyers, and they don't break the step down into the 4 different lists that we have here. And I was told that the reason we break them down into separate lists is because there are separate spiritual solutions to be applied to these manifestations of self that block us from God. Therefore, we have 4 separate lists for those 4 separate spiritual solutions. So today we're reading about the second paragraph down on 68. We had already gone over. The fears list is quite simply, I'm afraid of dying, I'm afraid of getting sick, I'm afraid of getting old, I'm afraid of being alone, I'm afraid of being broke, afraid of being homeless. And it's the same fears for everybody. The reason being is that we're all dealing with the same instinct, as Bill puts it, and there's a lot of instinct stuff in the 12 and 12. And to me, that was the reason for that 3rd column in the 4th step. I had asked myself for many years, what is that 3rd column, and too embarrassed to ask anybody else, and partly because nobody else seemed to know either. I only ran across one person in all my 20 years of sobriety who had any idea why that 3rd column is in the 4th step. And that 3rd column is in the 4th step, in the resentment list, I mean. But that 3rd column is in the resentment list because it's important to see that this is not an indictment of how bad of a person that we are. We're not saying to ourselves, I've been a real bad person, and here's how bad I was. I'm this bad and that bad. No. This is a search to find what blocks you from God. And it's not an indictment of how bad of a person we are. What we're saying here is that no one makes a conscious decision to get angry. That what I'm dealing with when I get angry is a reaction that I have no control over. The same way I had no control over my alcohol, I have no control over my anger. And I'm sure you guys have seen some hothead screaming it out with somebody else, and you can see how out of control that anger and that rage is. If somebody could step back from that rageaholic thing just for a minute and say, do you really think that you were in control in that situation? And then escalate that into a fist fight, knife fight, gun fight, whatever that goes on after that. But I can easily see when I think of it in that light that I never made a conscious decision to be angry. It was a reaction that I was having, and I had no control over it any more than I do my alcohol. Like I say, I am never going to take another drink as long as I live, and I look down in my hand, and there'd be a drink there, like some kind of blackout. I ended up with a drink in my hand, and the same way with that anger, and the same way with this fear. No one makes a conscious decision to be afraid. You see, we're dealing with our instincts, for our fears of not getting what we want in life and losing the things that we have. And it's a simple instinct for self-preservation. Almost, I always make the analogy of like if you're stomping around out in the wilderness in Asia or something and you look over and there's a 1,100-pound tiger pouncing on you, you don't make a decision, should I turn around and run for my life or should I just stand here and, eyeball it out with that tiger, although you're not going to run far if you don't have a firearm. But trust me when I tell you, you won't make a decision to turn and run. You're just going to turn and run, and that's all there is to it. And it's a reaction that you have. No one contemplates fear like that. It's just, Bill Wilson said the psychiatry was the study of the inner workings of the subconscious human mind, and that was one of my favorite things that he's brought up. It's in the Comes of Age, the study of the inner workings of the subconscious human mind, essentially saying, why do I do the things that I do? And I'm out of control with this stuff. Why is my fear out of control? Because I've never learned to apply the solutions to bring it under control. And that's one of the things that we're saying about these spiritual solutions is that I never learned how to deal with my anger other than letting it out. I just let it out, and there it would go, a screaming match with somebody, a fist fight, whatever it brought in, whatever came up. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make a conscious decision to try to attack these subconscious inner workings of my mind with a conscious activity that I'm going to perform. I'm going to practice these spiritual principles in all my affairs, and I'm going to eventually intuitively know how to handle these situations which used to baffle me. Do you understand what he's saying when he says we intuitively know how to handle situations which used to baffle us? He's saying that when I am dominated by these fears, I will intuitively know how to handle them. When anger is, and I'm going to rage over something that's stupid, and I'm going to intuitively know how to handle that situation because I have been practicing this principle in all my affairs. The principle of faith in God is the one that we're on today. And what we're the second paragraph down from the top, about 15 lines or something. Perhaps there's a better way. Last week we had gone over how to make the list, and it's a simple. Remember, it's the same fears that everybody has. Everybody's afraid of being broke. Everybody's afraid of being sick and dying, and then everybody's afraid of getting old and being alone. And I can't think of anybody who wouldn't be afraid of those things. Even though I have God, nobody. I mean, the fear is still there. It's just not as big. Okay, it's more like where it should be. Let's put it that way. I still have a fear of those things, but it doesn't drive me to the first drink anymore. It doesn't make me incapable of saying no to the first drink. And that is the premise of Alcoholics Anonymous, that what we're saying is when we reach for that first drink, that's rooted in fear. When my inability to say no to the first drink of alcohol is based in the fear that is tearing me. Fear is painful, and alcohol anesthetizes pain. Okay, so perhaps there's a better way than fear, obviously. We made this fears list, and he's saying, perhaps there's a better way than fear. We think so. For we are now on a different basis. Now, these two paragraphs, you say to yourself, he's explaining to us how to have faith in God, okay? Now, this is very important. I don't know about you guys, but some of this stuff is the most important thing in my life. And what he's saying here is that faith in God manifests in action, okay? It does not take place in my head. And I'll show you as I read through here that faith in God does not take place in our head. Faith in God must manifest in what we do with our lives every day. Otherwise, like this sign up here, and Bill Wilson writes frequently in the book, faith without works is dead. Okay, perhaps there's a better way. We think so. For we are now on a different basis, the basis of trusting and relying upon God. We trust infinite God rather than our finite selves. And this next few lines here is a reference. Actually, I think both of these paragraphs is a reference to step 12. What he's doing here is he's telling us that when we direct our attention to helping others through the 12 steps, learn the 12 steps and teach the 12 steps is the preamble. Our primary purpose is to stay sober and to help another alcoholic to achieve sobriety. How do we stay sober? The living of the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. And how do we help another alcoholic stay sober? By teaching the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, okay? Now look what he says here. We are in the world to play the role he assigns. Just to the extent that we would do as we think he would have us and humbly rely on him, does he enable us to match calamity with serenity. Now, in my experience, in the way that I've been taught over the years, that is a reference to doing step 12. If you do step 12, if you think of others and give your time to others and teach others the 12 steps, you will be free of the fear that drives you to the first drink. That is how Alcoholics Anonymous works. Once again, let's go over and read that same 2-3 lines again. We are in the world to play the role he assigns. Now, how can I think that he's assigned me that role? Because obviously I'm in Alcoholics Anonymous. This is the 12-step recovery program, not 11-step recovery program. And if you're not doing the 12th step, then how can you expect to get the results of the 12-step recovery program? Just to the extent that we do as we think he would have us, go out and help others through the 12 steps, and humbly rely on him, does he enable us to match calamity with serenity? In other words, something bad is going to happen. Remember the fears list we just wrote? I'm afraid of being sick. I'm afraid of being alone. I'm afraid of dying. I'm afraid of being broke. I'm afraid of being homeless. I'm afraid of this and that and the other. And guess what? Those things may very well happen, and you will match that calamity with serenity. We never apologize to anyone for depending upon our Creator. We can laugh at those who think spirituality the way of weakness. Paradoxically, remember that word spirituality is a reference to our connection to God. And our connection to God is a reference we use to describe what we do with our lives. Our daily, the inventory, the spiritual solutions, directing our attention to helping others. They trust their God. We never apologize for God. Instead, we let Him demonstrate through us what He can do. Now, this is like a reference to step 6 and 7 again. Remember, 6 and 7 is the step where you ask God to remove these defects of character or shortcomings or what the most common manifestations of self that block us from God's will, receiving and doing God's will. We ask Him to remove our fear. That's a reference to 6 and 7 there. In step 6 and 7, I'm going to ask God to remove my fear. And how am I going to know what fears I want God to remove if I don't have a list of them and know what they are? You understand why we have to put it on paper? Just like if I'm gonna ask God to help me with my resentments, how am I going to be free of those resentments if I don't know who they are and what the resentments are? So we ask Him to remove our fear and direct our attention to what He would have us be at once we commence to outgrow fear. You know, that little term right there, outgrow fear, at once we commence to outgrow fear. My first sponsor was he was down at the 12-step house, a real popular guy, sponsored half the damn place down there. Everybody knows him. He died about 5 or 6 years ago. He was real adamant about growing up. He said to me, listen, what's really going on with these 12 steps is we're trying to turn you from the child into an adult. And you need to look no further than the 4th step than to see the most common manifestations of self are anger, fear, and guilt, and selfishness. You understand? This is all about selfishness here. And what type of human being is it that is always angry and afraid and full of selfishness and feels guilty because he's hurting other people? Would you describe that as more a childish characteristic or an adult characteristic? Because I always thought of adults as being, people who had genuine concern for other people and people who did things for other people and expected nothing in return. And that to me was a wake-up call to me. I actually said, when my sponsor said that to me, I said to myself, I think you're right. I believe that I was a child and I'm trying to become an adult, and that's what's happening with these 12 steps is essentially growing up, okay? And you can easily see where he says that once we commence to outgrow fear. And remember that fear is the root of that obsession for that first drink. When that obsession for that first drink enters an alcoholic's mind, it is driven by fear, okay? So that is... Those 2 paragraphs are a reference to Step 12, and when we get out to Step 12, we'll go into some details on that. That's out in the chapter Working with Others, which is 89, 90. Yeah, 89, Working with Others. So next we got the sex inventory on the next page here. Now, before he gets to the sex inventory, there's 2 paragraphs here. And what these 2 paragraphs mean to me, I'll give you an example. When I first started sponsoring people, I would give people advice. They would call me on the phone and say, hey, you're my sponsor. You got, however many more years than I do. I got this problem. What should I do about this problem in my life? And I didn't know any better. I would tell them, this is what you ought to do. I got more time than you. I know more than you do, and you ought to do this with your problem. And these 2 paragraphs are telling us flat out that is not right. You have no right to tell another human being what they need to be doing with their life. Of course, he's talking about the sex inventory and their sexual behavior in their life. But that can be applied to any and every area of their lives, and I'll show you that later on in the 11th step where he says, what used to be the hunch or the occasional inspiration gradually becomes a working part of the mind. Essentially what he's saying is that I need to step back and let my sponsees make their mistakes so that they can learn from them. As long as, I believe what it says, if we stumble and we make mistakes in our program of recovery, we are not going to drink if we have the genuine desire to become a better person. If I make a mistake in my recovery, I will not drink over it, because in my heart I have a genuine desire to grow and become a better person. You understand that? And if somebody makes a mistake and doesn't care about it, and you say, F them, I don't care how other people are, I just don't care how they feel, that's not the right track. But if you make a mistake and hurt somebody and you're going to straighten it out and you don't want to do this anymore, that's the idea behind what that Step 11 statement is saying. But these two paragraphs are essentially saying that as an individual, I have no right to tell someone else how they need to act sexually or any other way when we get into it here. All I have the right to do is explain to them how to apply the 12 steps to the problem that they're calling me about. And every problem that they will have will fall into one of these three categories. Something you are angry about, something you are afraid of, or something that you feel guilty about that you've done that when you've harmed somebody else. Now he says, now about sex. Now this is step 4, list 4, the sex inventory. Harms done others sexually. Now about sex. Many of us needed an overhauling there. But above all, we try to be sensible on this question. It's so easy to get way off track. Here we find human opinions running to extremes, absurd extremes perhaps. One set of voices cry that sex is a lust of our lower nature, a base necessity of procreation. Then we have the voices who cry for sex and more sex, who bewail the institution of marriage, who think that most of the troubles of the race are traceable to sex causes. They think that we do not have enough of it, that it isn't the right kind. They see its significance everywhere. One school would allow man no flavor for his fare, and the other would have us all on a straight pepper diet. Now this is the part where he says what he was just getting at here. We want to stay out of this controversy. We do not want to be the arbiter of anyone's sex conduct. We all have sex problems. We'd hardly be human if we didn't. What can we do about them? You see, what he's saying here is we all have sex problems, but what are we going to do about it? He's fixing to tell us. We are going to make a list of our behavior in our sex relations to see where we were selfish and dishonest or inconsiderate. There are question marks in this next paragraph here. We reviewed our conduct. Inside this paragraph, this 6 or 8 lines are the directions for how to do this inventory. This list, step 4, list 4, harms done others sexually. Let's read it here. He says, we reviewed our own conduct over the years past. Where had we been selfish, dishonest, or inconsiderate? Whom had we hurt? So there's whom had we hurt is we're going to come up with the names of the women or men that we've been with, okay? First of all, we're going to write down their names, and then we're going to write down each specific dishonesty or selfish act that we had had. And this isn't a yes or no questionnaire. You don't say yes, no, yes. You write an answer, an imperative answer that you can look at. Remember what he said in the other lists. He says we turn back to the list, for it held the key to our future freedom from alcoholism. So the more information we get down here, the more we're going to see what it is when we get to steps 8 and 9, what we're going to ask God to help us to make amends for, okay? Remember that the spiritual solutions for each one of these lists is different, and the spiritual solution to harms done others is making amends. And there's the simple question of why do I make amends for harms done others? To be free of the guilt that's associated, because we believe that the guilt that is behind that is the lingering effect of what we've done that has harmed other people, that guilt blocks us off from God, just like anger and fear blocks us off from God. So those are the 3, what we call, remember what he said, the most common manifestations of self that block us, and these are all words from these pages of the Big Book. But the reason I'm lumping them together like this is because it makes it so much easier to understand what we're doing, and it makes it a more clear, precise picture of what this 4th step is. It is a search for the 3 or 4 most common manifestations of self, being that this selfishness is one of the words that he uses out in the 10th step, but selfishness also is the word describing the other 3, which is anger, fear, and guilt. The most common manifestations of self that block us from, remember back in Bill's story is the best place that we can find a description of God's will for us. And God's will, essentially, Bill says, for if he failed to perfect and enlarge his spiritual life, through work and self-sacrifice for others, he could not survive the certain trials and low spots ahead. That is the best description in here of God's will for us, that we enlarge our spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others. And this is what's blocking us from that, this anger, the fear, and the guilt, okay? And once again, we're going to see in this next paragraph down here that he's going to tell us that how to be free of the guilt associated with the harms that we had done is obviously making amends. Everybody's familiar with amends. It's easily pointed out in the ninth step, the 8 and ninth step. You can easily see that amends are up there. We got 20 minutes left, and we will pick up where we left off right there at the end of the... Actually, we didn't make it to the end of that. Let's hang on. Whom had we hurt is the names of the people. That's our 8th step list right there. Remember that the 8th step list, you don't make a new one. You go back to the 4th step and pull the names off of that. Did we unjustifiably arouse jealousy, suspicion, or bitterness? Question mark. Answer those questions. Where were we at fault? What should we have done instead? We got this all down on paper and looked at it. Okay, so next week we'll pick up, and these next 2 paragraphs are an explanation of how to be free of that guilt, which is making amends. And there are 9 pages in the 9th step describing those types of amends in some detail. You know, it's just not rocket science. If you owe money, you pay it back. If you cheated on the wife, don't do it anymore, and fess up. But anyway, we'll open up the floor for open discussion or questions if you have any, and we'll pick up right there. In this way, we try to shape a sound and sane and sound ideal for our future sex life next week, and we'll try to get through to the end of the to the end of the 4th step, and the 5th step the week after that. But anyway, does anybody have any questions, or someone would like to share on the 4th step? Anything that you'd like to share in general, AA wise? Looks like we lost Johnny, huh? He got up and walked out on us. Anybody would like to share anything? Nobody? Jeez, I thought you guys were all eager to talk and